Also bitte, wir sollen anfangen. Gut.
Macht man das? Ach, push, okay. Florian, hi.
Okay, welcome. We are going to begin our next session on youth sexual rights. And our first speaker is Professor Catherine Bond Stockton, who is Distinguished Professor of English at the University of Utah and has long been interested in the question of the queer child. And she defines that as any child who's interested in sex, because of course kids aren't supposed to be.
Actually, any child.
That's
Any child.
true.
Yes, no, it doesn't even have to be interested in sex, any child.
That's true, and she has a very fascinating book on the topic. She works on children's literature and children in literature, and I very much wanted to have her here to show how important literary and cultural studies are for framing the questions of the social and cultural attitudes that are behind our legal assumptions. So I think she's going to give us a really fascinating perspective. Catherine, please enlighten us.
Thank you very much for having me here. You may question Tom's wisdom after you see letting a humanities scholar loose in this environment, but I've been learning so much from the presentation, so I feel like I am going to school, which is very helpful. Let me just say, I am primarily a theorist, so I'm a literary person, and I've tried to take the theory speak out of this for the most part. So sections on Lacan and sections on Said and so forth. So if you want those restored, the Q&A is your place to get me to speak to those issues. All right, let's get started. 3 linked theories of my own making are the focus of this talk. Theory number 1, children say no homo. Theory number 2, the ghostly gay child shows every child is queer. Theory number 3, somewhere a child is desiring you, reverse pedophilia, American style. Let us begin. You are queer, whoever you are, because we're not the same, because we're all hetero, because there's no such thing as homosexuality. So say children. Theory number 1, children say no homo. Same-sex relations, same-sex marriage, same-sex sex, a bevy of beautiful, brilliant sameness. But here's the problem, as you know. Sameness itself is never the same. Not all sameness is created equal. Same class marriage, same class sex, we're all about it. Ask Jane Austen, that perverse hussy. In her novels, so crucial is it to keep class consolidated and forms of property all in the family that no good heroine marries a lover. No, she gains a lover by finding a new outside brother for her sister, and most importantly, by marrying his house. And same race relations, same race sex, so much do we love it, we tried to require it. As we all know, until 1967, you couldn't have hetero race sexuality in many US states. There were supposed to be white-on-white genitals, black-on-black genitals, though these samenesses were not equal. So why do we submit to the second-class sameness of same-sex sex? Does the thing we call sexual sameness even exist? It does not. Queerness isn't sameness. Sameness has been the ongoing fantasy of straight reproduction, white's reproduction, which is unraveled by actual children. Just take me, a self-professed seeker of same-sex sex since my childhood, except I don't believe in any such thing. For this reason which I perceived in childhood, I am not my girlfriend. We are not the same. Our genitals are different. Since mine are not hers, they are not the same. We use them differently. Their use is not the same. I do things to pleasure her a man could also do, and if she closed her eyes, she might think I were he. If she always closed her eyes, she'd never know if he was me. Let me sketch quickly our different ways of coming to what is called our sameness, a sameness so undone by the ways we've come to it. In fact, our child selves hold the key to our sexual self-differentiations. Follow me? No worries, just follow this. I was female assigned at birth, though thought I was a boy, mistaken for a girl. Born now, I might be trans, but I had no such concept as a child or a teen. Like a normal boy, I was drawn to girls, after we as boys got over hating girls. But since my world saw me as a girl, though I was to my mind the ultimate straight man seeking normally feminine women, I turned out a lesbian against my will, but in accord with my desires. As for my girlfriend, she was female assigned at birth, grew up to her mind normally feminine as a rural Mormon raised in rural Utah. In fact, she was engaged at age 19 to a beautiful man whom she would have married had he not died in a tragic car crash. After which she sought to go on a mission, though she was dreaming of swimming in the ocean, which you're not allowed to do while on a Mormon mission. At any rate, she went to see her bishop, who was a Buddhist who had become a Mormon. That's pretty rare. And he agreed she should not go on a mission. At which point she moved to San Diego to study world religions, where she heard about the Great Peace March, a march from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., all on foot to protest U.S. nuclear weapons. On that march, she met lesbians. Wished she could be one, so cool did they seem to her, but she figured she wasn't a lesbian. She moved back to Utah, started a rock band, and lo and behold, as the Bible says, she fell for their female saxophone player, who was female assigned at birth, but you know the story. And later, she found her way to me. We should know in passing, the good old sexologists from the 19th century into the 20th didn't know what to do with the femme. They tended to see her as a normal child who, as a woman, was led astray by a mannish lesbian who had been a queer child. And I must confess, so delightful is the femme that I had a little game that I devised in childhood to cheer myself up whenever I was low, called Femmes at the Mall. Here was my phantasmatic, virtually foolproof, virtual pastime. You know what I did. Hit a shopping center and imagined that every appealing woman who I deemed feminine was a femme lesbian until proven otherwise. Since I never tested them, they were not disproven. And therefore, due to this generous practice, the world was virtually full of lesbians, thanks to me. But the point remains, I was a gay child, my lover was not. We are not the same. The moral of the story, if I had gone trans, I would now be he, she would still be she, but we would not be we, since we might be straight by legal definition, able to be an opposite-sex married couple in the US. And isn't that queer? Or, to put this differently, my lover and I lack equal access to straight people's difference, even though straight people often dream of sameness in terms of class and race and children. On to the seeming specificity of the gay child. So now whenever I use the word gay here, always in quotation marks, you can ask me about that later. On to the seeming specificity of the gay child, which I want to argue actually serves to dramatize every child's queerness in the sense of strangeness. How can this be? It has to do with ghostliness tied to temporality. So I want you to see why I'm actually sort of speaking now about the ghostly gay child, not as opposed to, but in lieu of talking directly about the trans child. So we can talk about this later. Theory number 2, the ghostly gay child shows every child is queer. What a child is a darkening question. The question of the child makes us climb inside a cloud, a shadowy spot on a field of light. To put it less poetically, we don't know what children are. For at least a century in US culture, we've tried to make the child, largely white and middle class, a protected interval of non-complication, increasingly safe from labor, pain, and various pleasures, whose vaunted innocence as a child is primarily defined by weakness, all right? So this I know you know, but just keep this link in mind, because it's actually a reason why every child is queer, maybe the innocent child, the queerest child of all, all right? Yet the very moves to distance children from adulthood, so as to make them children, so as to make them innocent, have often made them stranger more foreign to adults. If they're seen as normative, they're normatively strange. If they're not so normative, they're dangerously strange. 4 dramatic historical developments in the US, scissoring with and against each other, make the child strange in these 2 ways in the 20th century, and maybe still. So here's just a little list I would give you. It really kind of freaked me out as a literary scholar that I could make a historical argument about this matter, which is to say the 20th century will have been the century of the ghostly gay child. So the first 2 changes that happen in US culture make the child normatively strange, right? So I don't have to tell you the beginnings of juvenile justice, 1899 in Chicago in the US. Make the child strange in relationship to adults in a new way. The agitation to abolish child labor in the US begins around 1901, takes till about 1938 to really sort of come to fruition. The last 2 changes create the possibility for the child to start being seen as dangerously strange. The writings of Freud, which we generally ignore in the American context, starting around 1900, suggesting that children are sexual, and very important, the adult concept of homosexuality emerging just around 1891, which is going to make available to children the word homosexual for them to identify with and around, whatever we think about that category. I would add, too, that the emergence of digital and video games is probably making the child more dangerously strange at this particular moment in time. The bottom line is this: children must live inside our figure of the child as the avatar of adult laws and adult beliefs. This child figure is strictly the act of adults looking back. It is not only who we no longer are, but also, in fact, who we never were. The gay child shows, the trans child shows, many racialized children show how the figure of the child in the US may not fit the people we call children, doesn't fit the pleasures and terrors we recall, we queer adults who are also looking back. Is there a gay child? There is the liquid circumstance of a child lingering in the vicinity of the word gay, having a secret, full-blown relationship with a concept. Remember, because as a child, I could be neither cisgendered nor transgendered, I was relating to the concept gay. So it seems to me here's like one answer to this whole question. I don't think we have to go born gay. We just have to show that children are having, many of them, a vibrant relationship with that word. And maybe they're right about that relationship or wrong, or retrospectively they change it, but children are relating to the word gay. We can talk about this later. I remember desperately feeling there was simply nowhere to grow. I wished that time would stop or just twist sideways so that I wouldn't proceed to further trouble. And even straight children have been technically not yet straight, since they too are not allowed to be sexual. The child who will be straight is merely approaching, while crucially delaying, the official destination of straight sexuality, and therefore showing itself as estranged from what it would approach. How does any child grow itself inside delay? The question is dramatized by the gay child who was put on hold in such intense ways. So throughout the length of the 20th century, the gay child is an impossible category. This is one of the key things that I'm arguing. Adding gay to child sounds like you're making a sexual child, at least in the ears of the general public, and that's not been allowed, even though the general public clearly presumes every child to be straight. The gay child has found no established forms to hold it in the public legal field, and thus it's been intensely unavailable to itself in the present tense. In fact, it has a backwards birth through retrospection and after a death. If you are a ghostly gay child, when you come out in your teens or 20s, you put to death your straight life in the eyes of your parents. You can finally say, I was a gay child. And until just recently, this has been the only grammatical formulation allowed to gay childhood in the US. The phrase gay child has been a gravestone marker for where or when one's straight life died. Straight person dead, gay child now born, even though one's childhood has expired. So basically, you've only ever been a gay child retrospectively when you're not a child, and that's what's happened. So in writing this book, I had to come up with a theory of sideways growth. That just because children are not allowed to grow up, whether trans children or ghostly gay children or whatever, in the sort of vertical fashion to proceed through these ranks of marriage and reproduction and so forth, doesn't mean that children aren't growing. And I can cite Darwin and all sorts of things for this idea of irregular growth, right? And of course, arrested development, you remember how important that category was in the history of homosexuality. My argument is, of course, people are always growing, and indeed we might need to think about irregular growth in this way, in these terms. The other thing I would say, here's my bias as an English professor, turns out fiction has a very important use. For the longest time throughout the 20th century, fiction is essentially the only place you will find the gay child vibrantly in any way, in literature, film, and memoir. So I can show you in Henry James and Radcliffe Hall and Junior Barnes and Virginia Woolf and Vladimir Nabokov and Capote, and I can keep on going. It has a vibrant, complicated life in fiction. But the gay child has literally not been in history. It's not in any history of childhood books in the 20th century. There's no historiography that I could find that presents itself as a history book telling the history of gay children. And in this sense, as often happens with history, history has been growing itself inside fiction. History's been growing itself outside itself. History's been growing itself to the side. History's had a sideways growth. So part of the question is, do you think this dynamic is radically changing? Is the gay child becoming present tense? And I would say anecdotally, I think that it is. I hear many more parents say, I think my child is gay, than the sort of thing that people routinely would say, I fear that my child may grow up to be a homosexual. It was always sort of in that future tense. So the question for me, going forward from here, is will the gay child desexualize gay? Now, we can have an argument about whether marriage is desexualizing gayness. Is a sort of recognition of a gay child identity in a kind of lockdown sense going to desexualize gay? Or will these gay children newly sexualize childhood? I think it's probably too early to tell. But my question now is this. Are we starting to believe in the US in a kind of grudging, fearful way that there are sexual children? Here would be some of the evidence that we are. Increasing numbers of gay kids, for example, coming out in middle schools, the whole discourse on sexual bullying, child-teen sexting, kids with HIV who are seen as sexually threatening when they enter school systems. So I'm thinking that we may be in a new twilight period of a gathering belief in, a fearful sense of sexual children. And if this is so, does this gathering belief or worry affect where the public needs to locate or perhaps rediscover its lost child? So now we're going to enter into the very speculative part of my program that I'm going to try to demonstrate with film and documentary, with documentary film. So here's the paradox we're about to enter, that the US general public feels the child is changing, becoming different, becoming more sexual, and thus I'm wondering whether we are exporting our faded sense of childhood to another land in order to recover it. In other words, we deem different children to be the same as ours, the same as we once knew them, vulnerable, weak, desirous of protection, so we can deal with our children's growing difference. They're run from our protections. But here's the bigger kicker I want you to listen to. Very well-meaning, well-made, human rights, art house documentaries that are quite sophisticated are messed up at the place of the face. So that's what I'm now going to try to show you. The child's face becomes a major problem in documentary film about children. That's kind of where these documentaries hit the brick wall. And as an English professor, two metaphors sort of come to mind. It's almost as if the child's face is, take your pick, either a kind of condom or a kind of chastity belt for the viewer, as a kind of weird protective mechanism to sort of protect the viewer against knowledge of these children's sexuality, the fact that these in many cases, of course, are vibrantly sexual children. So let's see how the face is doing this weird type of work, all right? And basically what I want to show you is that documentaries show us less of children than do fictions of fictionalized children. That's the point I'll be ending with. Theory number 3. Sorry, let me just see where I am. Theory number 3. Somewhere a child is desiring you. Reverse pedophilia, American style. Do you ever feel it? A face on your back. Some kind of image drops down on you, presses on you, floats momentarily, sticking to you. It's a fat platitude, you know that. Perversely, need is haunting you through a well-worn image, a human rights image, of a child no less. making you feel you're desired by a child, pursued by a child who needs your response. What kind of strange reverse pedophilic dynamic is this? Somewhere a child is desiring you, so you imagine, so you're led to feel. Here's the thick paradox, and it goes like this. The U.S. is outsourcing its child. The innocent child our country is so fond of is made overseas, discovered overseas in a very weird way. We as a public receive it for our purposes, use it for our purposes, then feel justified running from it as if its desire for us is threatening or somehow inappropriate. Thus, it's actually difficult to do what I believe is ethical for sexual citizens. Desire this child. Penetrate this child in this specific way. Get behind its face. Get beyond its face, by which I mean something tricky and hard. This could sound outlandish, but I don't know the motives that drive these documentaries in their creation. So this is not an argument about actually knowing their motives. Rather, I'm talking about the effects they make available and how these affect the liquid idea of the sexual child. Thus, I'm suggesting that new documentaries on the child in crisis in India, Malawi, Uganda, depicting children in peril by sex trade, civil war, and AIDS, are letting many viewers, through denying what they know to be true, through disavowal, to relocate the US-style innocent child to foreign soil where it can be found in inverted form, where its innocence is a back formation from its experience of extreme peril. That is, it can appear that these urgent films, through a loving backslap, grant their child protagonists the privilege of weakness that only these children's extraordinary peril can produce. And I'll tell you, these date from about the year 2000, from what I can tell, this sort of genre of world documentary that has played quite a bit at Sundance. Take Madonna's art house documentary, I Am Because We Are, focusing on children orphaned by AIDS, infected by AIDS, in the African country, Malawi. This is not the innocent US child on its long delay, nor is this our troubling child who is taking her own sexuality into her hands. This, I suspect, is our sexual child with its suffering turned back upon its head, where its harm can act like a wash, soaping, rinsing, buffing, suffering into a sheen we can read as weakness and thus as innocence. Thus, Madonna asks, aren't these the fears and hopes of any child? After her film has shown us a context that bears scant resemblance to anything we've known, if we are not Malawians or those who know Malawi, where the film instructs us 1 million children orphaned by AIDS out of the country's 12 million people seem to be everywhere, living on the streets, sleeping under bridges, hiding in buildings, being abducted, kidnapped, raped, circumstances leading to a state of emergency. But quite perversely, it is these very differences in the lives of children that make Malawi's children, at least for many viewers, super candidates for the American-style innocent child who, above all, needs our protection. A flattened version of US childhood, one we've had to start doubting ourselves, is thus magically restored on foreign soil through, of all things, the sexualized, racialized, poverty-stricken HIV child. But in the end, Madonna's film cannot produce an image I haven't seen all of my life, though I've never seen these specific children. I mean that particular African image glazing our eyes, the one many viewers will know from CARE or UNICEF ads since their childhood. Me on Halloween with my UNICEF box, collecting coins for this image in my head. You know the image, a glossy reproduction of a glassy stare in high definition. Lassitude with resilience, Madonna's favorite word. Resilience hard to see, even if I know it's there. Completely strange to say, each child's face, its most personal, most tender signifier, makes me not see the children I am viewing. I can't see these children because these children are blocking my view of them, themselves. This grim tautology meets and defeats my gaze at every turn, making me try, as Madonna's viewer, to do an impossible visual maneuver, stiff-arm the image, stiff-arm the child, so as to slip behind its face, to see around what the image is showing me and not telling me. What does it mean in this country for so many children to wear, in their illness or their orphanhood, a sexual and sexually stigmatizing signifier, HIV/AIDS, which is highly stigmatizing in their country? There's a world of signification lurking here, right behind the face. But the film doesn't touch on this lurking world. In fact, we understand why these films all give us uplift narratives to soothe our encounter with these children's pain. It's not just the wish to make children something other than victims, which of course is laudable. It's also a concession to Western heartbreak, the filmmaker's fear of breaking our hearts, which we might feel threatened with, and so might cause our turning away, the filmmaker's nightmare. So they're walking a very fine line here. No wonder these films each have their own way of keeping up our spirits with their kids' resilience long enough to move us toward these children's innocence, shown by the extremity of their experience. Born into Brothels takes a clever attack. The children that we follow are each given cameras and taught still photography by the movie's filmmakers, in the clear hope of showing these children's latent talents and showing us, how they see the world. But the film begins with its own camera work, giving us close-ups of the children's faces, close-cropped, shadowed, then turned to the light, that resonate strongly with African images and, I would say, impede our gaze. Then the movie camera snakes with an undulating, sinister motion through the darkened alleys where the brothels hide, while a voice tells us it's almost impossible to photograph in the red light district. This confession makes us hope that what the children photograph will be especially telling, will take us beyond the intriguing hints of their thoughts embedded in fragments that we hear. So here are just some of the fragments you hear in the film. One has to accept life as being sad and painful, that's all. I need to make a living and take care of my sister. My father tried to sell me. I know what my mother does for work, and I feel bad talking about these things. My friend has talked to me about it many times and asked me not to tell anyone. These oral fragments, seductive, incomplete, remain the film's most illuminating signifiers because the kids' cameras do not show us anything the filmmakers' cameras aren't showing too. Here we hit the glass of tautology again, crashingly stopped by visual signifiers blocking our sight, a blockage now produced from a different angle. Think of a box inside a box inside a box. In fact, quite literally, the film's movie camera films a kid with camera taking a picture the film then develops before our eyes, as if the children's pictures are sophisticated Polaroids that nakedly, suddenly reveal themselves to sight, but only as the movie's camera lets them. And more inside the box, the photographs the filmmakers film as selections of the kids' work, often striking stills in saturated color of some street scene, become indistinguishable from the aestheticized art house photographs viewers have seen of these locales, in which the kids are sweetly, generously led, with no bad faith, to reinvent, for a show entitled Through the Eyes of a Child. Seeing through their eyes, therefore, leads us tautologically not only to what we've just been seeing from the movie camera, but also to what we could see at Sotheby's, where their photographs are later sold. The trailer to the film itself says as much, led by the compassion of one woman from the streets of Calcutta to an auction block at Sotheby's, the story of a woman's courageous vision and the children who made it happen. Perhaps no surprise, the children's camera talent enacts the film's vision in a subtle reversal of purpose. And indeed, we realize that what the film captures more than anything else, what the kids capture via their cameras, is the steady stream of images aimed at them, entering them, coming through the viewfinder, penetrating children's eyes in this context in a kind of child invagination of sexual signification taking place through their eyeballs or their ear holes. If only we could hear about what they see. What do they grasp about their mother's work, which is largely performed inside the home, just beyond a curtain's veil dropped inside a room? What do they think about the future's plan for them, which for the girls involve this work? What does it mean for their or their brother's sexual imaginations as children? War dance almost seems hip to the problem of facial blockage and the need to loosen its children's tongues. But since the topic is war, not sex, this loosening is possible. So I want you to see the difference that the war narrative makes. And this documentary ups the ante of narrative uplift as it shows northern Ugandan children preparing to perform at a music festival in their nation's capital. So the viewer can go like, oh, I'm just so excited to see them, do this music contest thing. These are children who have lost their parents to murders by rebels or themselves have murdered at the rebels' orders to kill or be killed. Rather profoundly, unlike Madonna or Born into Brothels, the filmmakers highlight their dearth of images for what the children will directly tell us. So it becomes almost like an anti-documentary in this way. In fact, each child stands firmly planted in front of the camera, slightly to the left of center of frame, with an unusual assurance, defiance, anger, unnerving matter-of-factness, or just a you don't know me stance, or a posture of let me stiff-arm you before you find yourself blocked by my face, as he or she narrates atrocities. As the stories hit our ears, the camera often takes us gently into the Ugandan bush, just yards away from where the child is standing. In its move from resistant face to foliage, the visual register is throwing in the towel in a very striking way, confessing there's no image to match these children's words. Instead, there's intensity. Nothing looks sinister, just intense, and at times, intensely beautiful. Even when the weather's storming, slamming, or the movie camera gives us a spider eating flies in silhouette. Yellow-green grass is often framed against blue-black sky of remarkable density. A mottled moon shows up against cerulean. Most of the colors are bright, not hot. Only intermittently does anything look heated at the sky's rim. But the saturation of these colors is arresting, especially at metallic twilight. So what I'm simply trying to show you is it just moves to a visual register of all this sort of beautiful intensity because it cannot go anywhere near providing images for these children's narratives. And we have the children speaking to us, sometimes at the camera, sometimes as a disembodied voice that is speaking over the image of them, with them looking smack at us or standing with their backs to us. The deaths I saw were terrifying. I haven't had the courage yet to tell anyone what really happened out there. One girl tells of being taken by a rebel to a place by a tree where a pot was cooking something. When I saw my mother's head being pulled from a pot, the girl calmly states, I felt like I was losing my mind. There's now nothing more I can say. Later, a xylophone-playing boy with Donald Duck emblazoned on his shirt stands before us and narrates his abduction in chilling detail with these same signifiers, bush, trees, navy blue sky, and one abandoned building along with a hoe to adorn his words. The rebels ordered us to kill some farmers with their own hoe. Anyone caught covering their face would be killed along with the farmers. We started beating the backs of their heads over and over. Their legs were kicking, but their heads were not moving. You are the first to know I have killed. Something is striking here. The African child stock image I'm familiar with is finally on the move in some new way. The same signifiers used for children seeing murder are used for children made to murder, coloring innocence, if we're still clinging to it, with new shades of tortured self-knowledge, even self-fragmentation, and lifelong memories of bodily actions that will lurk inside one's skin, whatever one does with them. But if the topic here were sexuality, rape, let's say, children raped or made to rape, I doubt we get the chance to encounter, even slantwise, non-pictorially, these textured narratives of trauma from the children. What's the upshot then? We may need a queerer ethics of the face, where the question becomes, is there a seduction, a scene of desire we enter into? Do we take the bait to find the story of the face? We must be seduced by a face on the move. Enter, come behind it, agree to be its analyst, take its suffering as your passion, not compassion. It doesn't ask for that. Can this be accomplished? Marguerite Duras has done it. In The Lover, she's alluring through the face of a child, showing once again that fiction may be the only place where we can hear the tonal spread, the tonal stack of child sexuality that cuts the face of the racial cliche of the child in peril in the third world. And let me say, because I'm stopping here, it's amazing what Dara gets to swim inside the face. Slow death not shorn of pleasure, interest in child sexuality, amid the child's racialized demand for someone's money, since she's suffering from colonizer poverty and sleeping as a girl with a Chinese man, which she wants to do. Imagine a documentary on children or financial destitution offering this seduction. Will you come in? Will you penetrate the face with the organ of your ear? Somewhere a child is desiring you, and there is peril and there is poverty, but there's no innocence and no one is running. We are listening for what we might learn to ask. We are reading. We're seduced. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was very thought-provoking. And we will have an opportunity to ask questions of Catherine and the other panelists at the end. But let me first introduce Gert Hekma, who is not here. In fact, you see I'm actually sitting in the chair that bears Gert's name. Gert very much looked forward to coming to this conference ever since I first started organizing it 2 years ago. But unfortunately, he fell sick, very ill, last week, and was simply not in a position to travel. But he may very well be watching us this very moment, because as many of you know, this is being video streamed worldwide through the web, and we may have a much larger audience than the many of you we see in this room. Now, Gert's paper is looking at this question of youth sexuality within the context of radical gay liberation and movements surrounding pederasty and pedophilia within the Netherlands. He has sent me a shorter version of his paper. Much longer version is going to be published in Dutch very soon, and we hope eventually in English translation. So let me tell you what Gert has to say, and then with the next speaker, Florian Mildenberger, we're going to hear something very similar about the appropriation and successive disowning of a youth rights agenda within the German movement. Only in the 1950s did the concept of pedophilia receive more serious attention. Until that time, it was not clearly separated from homosexuality. To the contrary, the assumption was that gay men had to recruit boys to fill their ranks. The theory of pederastic seduction was more generally accepted as the cause of homosexuality than the theory of an innate identity, as the homophile movement claimed. But at the end of the 1950s, the Netherlands saw the development of pedophile organizing with Frits Bernhard and Ed Brongersma as its most important proponents. The homophile movement wanted to be respectable, and since 1960 assumed more distance from drag, boy lovers, and leather lovers. But the sexual reform movement in the Netherlands, NVSH, took up these causes after 1970. In the slipstream of the successful gay emancipation struggle, the idea was that transsexuals, transvestites, sadomasochists, exhibitionists, and pedophiles could follow suit. The situation seemed promising. In the 1960s, the Netherlands had suddenly changed from an orthodox and puritanical country to a symbol of the sexual revolution. Its driving force was a revolt against the oppressive authority of politics, religion, family, psychiatry, education, police, justice, and so on. Gay men struggled against the homophobia of families, feminists against sexism and patriarchy, believers against dogmas of clergymen and bishops, pupils and students against educational hierarchies, soldiers against conscription, and so on. The remarkable point was that many persons in positions of power joined this mood of change. Anti-psychiatrists took the case of the insane. Teachers and professors supported their students. Priests left the church. Parents were inspired by anti-authoritarian education. Remarkably, police officers thought that the damage of pedophile relations may not be in the sexual contact, but in their interventions or in attitudes of parents. Against demands for authority, progressives formulated ideals of self-determination and free love, not only for adults, but including minors who were held to be able to take responsibility for their own life, even as young as 12 years old. The Dutch movement for sexual reform created a group of pedophiles that made the following points. Adults and minors could enjoy such relations, they were not harmful, and could even be educational in intellectual and sexual terms. The sexual act was rarely penetration. Boys did not become gay because they were seduced by men. Boys often took the initiative themselves. Books with stories of pedophile lovers and beloveds were produced that illustrated these points. There were many fellow travelers, and in 1980, most left and liberal parties were in favor of a lower age of consent at 12 instead of 16. Psychiatrists, psychologists, lawyers, police officers, feminists, gay movements, abortion and family planning activists, and parents supported this goal. The example of the homosexual movement promised progress for other sexual minorities. This ideal broke down in the 1980s with the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. The main reasons in the case of pederasty were fights of feminists against paternal abuse of daughters that transformed into concern about strangers abusing children and moral panics concerning child abuse, culminating with the Dutroux scandal in Belgium. One could also add that in the 1990s, the spirit of the sexual revolution was broken and that ideals of autonomy were replaced by ideas of risk, victimhood, and protection. In the new century, demonization became the destiny of the pedophile movement. 4 points show a radical turn in the views on sexual contacts with minors. These changes propose an explanation for the surprising demonization of pedophilia. In the first place, opinions changed on sexual relations between minors and adults. Studies done in the aftermath of the sexual revolution, such as Theo Sanfort's work, indicated that they were not harmful under the condition that there was no force being used or no dependency relation as in the family, and that the youth knew what they were doing. A meta-analysis later confirmed these results, and that was the famous study of Bruce Rind and colleagues that earned a unanimous vote of the US Congress condemning it in 1999. Rather negative responses from the environment, such as interventions by parents or police, created possible harm, as the conviction was in those days, and police officers agreed with that view. But nowadays, public opinion insists that all physical contacts of and with youth under 16 are per se, actually in this country under 18, are per se damaging, as indicated with the underwear rule. Don't touch a minor under 16 where undies belong. A second transformation regards the idea of sexual self-determination. The ideal of the sexual revolution was autonomy, and that was not the case for women and gays, and neither for youngsters. Many believed in independence and stressed that the state should not be a censor. Institutions such as parenthood, church, psychiatry, and school inhibited the maturation of youth, and that should be stopped. Pedophiles could play a positive role in the development of responsibility and in sexual education, both in and outside bed. Nowadays, children are seen as immature and innocent and needing to be kept in this blessed state. The result was an age of consent that went down and up from 21 and 16 to 12 and back up again to 16 and 18 years. In an always safer world, children should be sheltered against sexual dangers that they often desire. Sexuality of youngsters has not become part of the struggle for human rights, except in terms of protection and risk avoidance. Youth are not acknowledged as sovereign beings, and the least in their sexuality. Feminists started to make a case against paternal abuse of daughters. In the meantime, that anxiety has been displaced to the more rare stranger danger, mainly a myth that created its own reality. In the third place, the sexual revolution was a struggle of generations where parents stood opposite children. The authority of church, politics, and science faced harsh criticism by a younger generation, including institutions of parenthood, nuclear family, and marriage. Relations were inverted, authority of parents debunked, and space was created for social and sexual alternatives such as communes, cohabitation, plural love, or pedophilia. Nowadays, the disciplining of children is done not harshly but softly. The exertion of parental power has become more effective with the use of emotion and empathy instead of authority and power. State support for parental control in the nuclear family has increased with social health, financial, and legal measures. Because there are fewer children, they have become more valuable, and emotional involvement in the family has increased. Nuclear families rely less on the extended family, and nuclear families rely less on the extended family or the neighborhood, and this made relations inside them more intensive. Internal dependency grew, and the nuclear family became an incestuous hotbed, in the words of Foucault. When it comes to self-determination of children in these nests, parents pull the strings with emotional strategies. The fourth point regards ideals of equality. For most of history, the norm in sexual relations was inequality, as between husband and wife, queer and trade, butch and femme, sex worker and client. This radically changed with the sexual revolution. Pedophilia was from the beginning an anomaly. It found space as a result of greater freedoms in the slipstream of sexual reform and gay emancipation. But at the same time, it stood in stark contrast with the new ideal of equality. What a leading sociologist said with so many words on sexual freedom, that it is only valid in equivalent, symmetrical, democratic, equal relations, was not the norm, but became a compulsory ideal. Pedophilia is not the only victim of this transition. The same is true for traditional heterosexual relations, prostitution, bestiality, or sadomasochism, all of which run the risk to isolate this new ideal of equality. It was evident for devotees of the sexual revolution that youth under 16 had sex with and among themselves and with adults. Children are curious and go searching and end up finding. Preparing them for their sexual citizenship seems to be a better solution than keeping them innocent and forbidding them behaviors that most adults desire and consider worth pursuing. A total prohibition on sexual contacts with a high age of consent is preposterous. Prosecution of true abuse, often difficult to assess, is more urgent than prohibition of freely chosen sexual contacts between mature people, whether they are minor or adult. Youngsters know ever more about sexuality through media, the internet, and earlier onset of puberty. The question of pedophilia, like the concern with sexualization of girls, puts the finger on a sore spot. Western societies do not know how to deal with children's sexuality and continue to insist on their innocence. With blind zeal, presumed risks are cleared away that do not stop dangers and neither promote pleasures. Protection against sex wins out over erotic self-determination. Many young people know what they want and like and are able to determine so before they turn 16. The task for educators is to guide and prepare them. The government should, by way of schooling, promote erotic knowledge and self-consciousness and provide sexual citizenship lessons. Good for youngsters themselves and for their future public relations. This happens too little, which raises the question, who is responsible for this situation? Instead of sexual self-determination, the focus is put on protection of young people against their own sexual wishes and those of third parties. Equality is good for politics, or all human beings are innocent. I mean, human beings are equivalent. But it's not good for sexuality. Most erotic relations are unequal and not democratic or symmetrical in terms of gender, age, race, class, education, or beauty. Inequality is the rule in sexual lives when we look at economic, cultural, social, or erotic capital. It can be highly exciting, as with BDSM. The ideal of equality clashes with that other norm of diversity. Why should equality be more acceptable in sexual relations than inequality? Equivalence certainly does not exist between educators and children. This is broadly accepted, although it breeds many dangers because of power differences, privacy, and secrecy. Risks like violence, abuse, indoctrination, and lack of freedom. Parents have obligations regarding children, but also exclusive rights over them, especially with regard to sexual socialization. Educators enforce gender and sexual norms upon youth and keep them apart from strangers who might shed a different light on these issues. To be sure, that troubles young people who show non-normative behavior. Relations with third parties will be more equal than those with parents because children have more possibilities to exert power with strangers. A general misunderstanding is that parents always have good intentions and pedophiles bad. It should be worthwhile to conceive children's rights beyond the idea that they have to be protected against sexual diversions. Parents play a central role in the continuation of straight norms, of which moral panics are part and parcel. Since the sexual revolution, the paternal position and heteronormativity have been strengthened. The nuclear family, so demonized in the 1960s for its sexism and homophobia, is nowadays again seen as a safe haven in a heartless world. Looked upon from this side, the pedophile embodies the ultimate danger. He imperils straight norms of coupling, monogamy, mediocre sex, reproduction, and age hierarchies, and marks the disproportional power that is assigned to parents. He is the whipping boy of a perverse system that preaches sexual liberalism, but that embodies fear of sex. It does not promise any good for youth. Well, remember, that's Gert speaking, not me. And Gert always likes to provoke, and he may be even more eager to provoke when he's not here. But we'll have a chance to discuss all of this. But let me now introduce our next speaker, Professor Florian Mildenberger, who is a historian. So we really do have more than one humanist here.
Historian of medicine.
I'm a humanist too. I mean, you're in good company. And yes, Florian's work especially has to do with the history of medicine, I mean, he's currently doing some fascinating work on the subject of homeopathy, and but however, today he's talking about something rather different, which is pertaining to the perceptions of pedophilia within the German left and sexual liberation movement. So, Florian, please.
Thank you very much for this invitation, and of course I'm interested in many healing cultures. So I was fascinated by this chiropractic self-healing effect here. We will talk about it. My topic is pedophilia in Germany and the discourse since 19th century, especially in 20th century. Discourse about pedophilia in Germany today is the result of a successful emancipation of the homosexuals, of course, not the pedophiliacs. Homosexual emancipation and its turn into a civil rights club for well-off white people instead of a social movement made it necessary to emancipate from former allies, who will never be part of a common society. Next to some radical peace groups, especially pedophiliacs, had been nixed from the list of welcome friends of the homosexual emancipation movement in Germany. On this way into the heart of middle-class Germany, many important points for an objective discourse were abundant. Most important, the separation between pedophilia and hebephilia. In Germany we call it ephebophilia. Hebephilia means sexual interest of adults with pubescence and vice versa, while pedophilia refers to real children before puberty. Theory. In my lecture, I will concentrate mostly on homosexual pedophilia because despite of the fact most sexual offense takes place against females, the discourse are mostly concentrated on seduced boys. Of course, you have sources about criminal cases back to Middle Ages, but modern disputes began in the second half of the 19th century. To speak with Foucault, nameless crime, sometimes called sodomy, pederastia, bestial sin, or sin against nature, was renamed into a medical classification. The contrary sexual perception or feeling, konträre Sexualempfindung, called in Germany. These were sexual relations between same-sex adults, mostly men, and between adults and minors. What were minors? All people with civil rights younger than the legal age. What is the legal age? In Prussia, this meant 25 years. In England, 27. In some US states, 21. And it just worked with civil people, not soldiers. You could become lieutenant in Germany with 18 years when you were legally a minor, a child. But you can shoot people. The separation of sexual relations of adults with adults from sex and adults with non-adults came after 1880. The Austrian psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing formed the expression pedophilia erotica and wrote, "A child could be seen as a fetish." That's quite interesting because in today's politics, self-appointed family rescuer use children for their own interest as a fetish. As you can read in the essays of Lee Edelman. Of course, Krafft-Ebing had a different view. He separated in homosexual interests, who might be out of punishment in future sometimes, and pedophilia, who should be punished for society's moral security. Krafft-Ebing didn't differ between adolescents, boys, girls, or children at all. He was a representative of an older generation. He had finished school with 16 years, and began to study in an age when most of his latest students could not be seen as adults. If Krafft-Ebing had had sex with a prostitute when he was in the age of 14 years, when it was usual, he would be seen as a victim of sexual abuse today discourse, or even by his own students 40 years later, in 1880s. Krafft-Ebing himself made another statement. Boys might have sexual intercourse with adults, but they would never turn into homosexuals just because of having sex with men. The Berlin psychiatrist and sexologist Albert Moll wrote in 1898, adolescents or children might develop sexual interests in adults from their own, an important issue for later discussions or pedophilia in the Western world. In 1909, Moll cancelled this investigation, but nobody noticed it. Moll introduced a new explanation why adults may have sex with non-adults, especially boys. The boys would be dependent and weak as women, so men would prefer them. Moll also believed he could convert homosexuals by psychotherapy. Around 1900, you had many concepts who would be important during the next decades. I didn't miss psychoanalysis, but this school didn't gain influence in Germany for a long time. If you read Sigmund Freud's ideas about homosexuality, especially in the 3 essays from 1905, you see a psychological interpretation of homosexuality. Even if you don't interpret it today, for contemporary homosexuals or pedophiliacs, psychoanalysis sounded like a scientific approach to prove the effect of seduction. This might help to explain why the homosexual emancipation movement, formed around 1900 in Berlin under the leadership of Magnus Hirschfeld, never became warm with Sigmund Freud. Hirschfeld persuaded many persons of public life to sign a petition to the parliament, to the Reichstag, to abolish paragraph 175 of the German penal law. This paragraph condemned homosexual intercourse in any way. Paragraph 176, who wasn't mentioned by Hirschfeld, ruled punishment of pedophiliacs. Despite this fact, Hirschfeld separated, conservative politicians and church representatives argued homosexuals would seduce German youth. There were some exemplary processes around 1900-1910 who speeded the discourse, and this made it suitable for the sexual reform movement to nix pedophiliacs from their agenda. In First World War, hundreds of thousands of young men were killed in the trench battles, and German psychiatrists called for higher birth rate. They identified a danger for the Germanic race, homosexuals, who seduced and converted German youth into homosexuals. Race hygienists declared homosexuals kill the race in every case, and they are all interested in the youth, the boys. So sexologists were nearly forced to separate the good homosexuals from the bad boy lovers. At the same time, new ideas were introduced into public debates. For example, castration. So Magnus Hirschfeld wrote in 1928, homosexuals were untreatable, but pedophiliacs may be harmless by castration. He called pedophiliacs Sittlichkeitsverbrecher, sex offenders, while homosexuals were just a variant in nature. But all discourses changed after 1933, when the Nazis came to power, so the official historiography. Did it? Did the National Socialists found a new sexology? If you read the writings of Dagmar Herzog, you see National Socialist eugenic politics is unthinkable without sexological works from the 1920s. And so it goes on after 1945, of course. In official policy, Nazis condemned sexology as a product of Jewish corruption, but many results were used for practical eugenic politics. The Nazis continued Hirschfeld's separation between homosexuals and pedophiliacs. Pedophiliacs were forced to castration in the law against professional criminals. Homosexuals weren't mentioned in this law. They weren't professional criminals, but a problem for medical eugenics, so they could deny voluntarily for castration to protect the Volksgemeinschaft. But they weren't forced officially. While many German psychiatrists discussed etiology of homosexuality, nearly nobody wrote about pedophilia. Probably existing pedagogical errors in the male comradeship, who had been glamorized in everyday propaganda, made it difficult to discuss the topic. Heterosexual pedophilia was a greater problem. There were some promising careers who were doomed. The first nudist in National Socialism, the great promoter of Olympic Games in 1936, Hans Surein, stumbled over a sexual affair with a 13-year-old young girl, and the SS leader Oskar Dirlewanger was sent to prison for having sex with some girls under 16. Later he became commander of the SS Punitive Brigade, the most cruel military unit in the Second World War. A more professional debate over pedophilia started when, after 1945, by researchers in the Western German Society for Sexual Research, led by psychiatrists Hans-Birger Prinz and Hans Giese. Hans-Birger Prinz had been one of the main psychiatrists in the Third Reich and who had sent about 4,000 mental ill people to gas chambers. That's by the way. Giese and Birger Prinz overtook Hirschfeld's separation between homosexuality and pedophilia. Giese himself argued there were high-value homosexuals who had long-time, same-age partners and who refused promiscuity. They would live some like gay marriage. They should become free of punishment. But all sexual human beings who were unable or unwilling for long-term relationships should stay out of the society. The legal situation had changed also in 1953. Federal Republic of Germany announced a new law for orphans and neglected adolescents. The Nazi paragraph 175 was still in use in Western Germany. In Eastern Germany, in the GDR, the paragraph from 1871 was used. But the federal law for orphans from 1953 was part of a plan for a Christian sanitary movement to destroy all subcultures for sexual minorities. No longer pedophiliacs, homosexuals should be in the center of interest for sexologists, criminologists, or the police, but their home ground. Up to 1950s, German researchers were absolutely sure victims of pedophile men were innocent children, and they were innocent because they were unsexual. German doctors believed in a concord between sexual activity and legal age. Every sexual active girl or boy would be degenerated, genetic garbage, and of course an incident, a unique incident. Not a problem at all. Psychiatrists and police believed in a 100% success rate in research and punishment. But then the Kinsey report came to public. German researchers had to accept that sexual maturation wouldn't come at the age of 18 or 21, but within 13 years in girls and 15 in boys. But if these adolescents were ready for having sex, and if they had sex, what does this mean for their credibility in courts or for their future? German sexual researchers had to accept they were out of everyday life. So, because of Kinsey report, they opposed last attempts of conservative politicians for a new counter-reform of penal laws. In 1962, right-wing politicians, including my grandfather, offered a catalogue of measures against sexual minorities, including lifelong preventive custody. They failed. A new coalition for sexual reforms was formed, not only by doctors like Giese or Birger Prinz, but icons of sociology and law reforms as Theodor Adorno or Fritz Bauer. They demanded a new sexual law for the nature of men, not against them. This included demands for removal of taboos regarding sexual active youth and, of course, decriminalization of homosexuality. Psychic damage to adolescents who had sex with adults were theories not provable, Adorno wrote. They all believed in the triumph of education over genetics. And in 1961, contraception pill was legalized. What does this mean with pedophilia? I explain. Every woman was free for having sex without fear becoming pregnant. And a man shouldn't have the right for having sex just because he was homosexual? The ideological requirements of German conservatism collapsed. In 1969, paragraph 175 was liberalized. The GDR was faster for 1 year. The sex wave overflooded Western Germany with pornography, posters, films, books, journals, and the separation between adults and adolescents disappeared. Regarding pedophilia, a new generation of lawyers, criminologists, and sexologists made new questions where and why pedophilia took place. No longer vague subcultures were made responsible. Their own home, the family, might be the major place for pedosexual activities. Not only men, but also women would be the older partners. One of these studies was written by Eberhard Schorsch, the most important pupil of Birger Prinz and Giese. And Schorsch saw it was impossible to construct a special type of the one and only pedophiliac. Even the separation between the homosexual and the pedophiliac, who didn't exist in a clear form, was topic of discussion. The new formed gay movement in Western Germany accepted this interpretation, or they didn't challenge it because they were stupid. Homosexual pedophiliacs found their places in this movement. The first and second generation of German gay movement felt as a part in a major fight to liberate all the condemned and suppressed groups and people in the world. But this ideal failed when dogmatic communists declared homosexuality for a bourgeois vice, which would be extinguished after socialist revolution. Some of these dogmatic communists later converted to Green Party, and the last idiot of this time was the Green frontrunner for the parliament election in 2013, Jürgen Trittin. There were two important persons for a pedophilia debate in Germany in 1970s. At first, Peter Schult, and second, Alice Schwarzer. Schult had been the most important organizer for the prison work. Left-wing and liberal promoters outside the prison made propaganda for imprisoned terrorists from the Rote Armee-Fraktion or the Bewegung 2. Juni. This was the left-wing terrorist groups in Western Germany. Schult organized and centralized this work, made it more effective, and reduced the effects of supervision by the state. He had been a former member of the French Foreign Legion. He had sex with pubescent boys from 12 to 15 years. And Schult lived in the left-wing and gay communities in Munich in the 1970s. When Schult was accused for his sexual desire by the state, a great supporting community made demonstrations and petitions. But in 1976, a female journalist wrote, pedophilia would be a crime every time, because it came from men. Every pedophiliac would be a criminal, and all of his partners were innocent victims. The name of the journalist was Alice Schwarzer. Schwarzer became the most important figure in Western German feminism and quite influential up to today. Schult and many other communists japed, Schwarzer's only escape against sexual suppression was lesbian sexuality. And Schwarzer denied existence of female pedophiliacs and suppression in lesbian relationships at all. Last but not least, she made no difference in the age. Similar to race hygienists, she only saw adults over 18 years and children. Black and white, no shades of grey. But as long as Schwarzer was just one of many women in small political groups, this wasn't important. She hadn't more influence than Schult or anyone else in the small socialist sects. At the end of the 1970s, German left terrorism had lost its glance and importance. The state had won the war. And the small communist groups began to disperse. The former 20-year young revolutionists had turned in 30 or 35-year-old guys without perspective. Parents didn't pay anymore. Revolution didn't fill the day. They became interested in being a part of the system they had called before fascist or post-fascist. They didn't want to wait for an alternative anymore. So they captured another social movement who had been out of scope for many years, the Green or ecological movement. In the new formed Green Party, sexual emancipation had been an important issue, and the academic sexological research of the 1970s was still sure consent, sexual relations between adults and adolescents over 12 or over 14 years wouldn't be a problem. But then, three major points changed everything. At first, the idol for revolutionary pedophilia, Peter Schult, died in spring 1984. Green and socialist politicians and journalists had lost their favorite partner in discussions. There were just some anarchistic, stupid pedophiliac circles anymore. The quarreled Green Party was searching for a common enemy to strengthen program and members. And when the party failed to come into parliament in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia in Western Germany, you can say it's the Illinois of Western Germany, in 1985, they accused pedophiliacs guilty. Their propaganda should be responsible for defeat, so they were kicked out of Green Party and indirectly out of the left and liberal community. Did the Green Party lose a 6-month running election fight just because of about 30 pedophiliacs with their demand for sex between adults and minors? Of course not, but this wasn't the topic anymore, because, second point, AIDS arose and the gay movement needed strong allies. Former communists in the Green movement thought this could be a nice end of homosexuality at all without a revolution. But Alice Schwarzer, with her capitalistic journal Emma assisted the hard-pressed homosexuals. She demanded solidarity for gay men. For men and only for men, who desired men, of course, and not women. And the weak gay movement, exhausted from fruitless debates over pedophilia and the fight for total abandonment of paragraph 175, accepted. And third point, a new interpretation of pedophilia came to German discourse. Since 1979, the American psychologist David Finkelhor reinterpreted and revised all the publications about pedophilia in medical journals since 1900, and he came to an interesting interpretation. Finkelhor declared, sexual research had shown that a childhood free of every kind of sexual feeling existed. He denied all the efforts in psychoanalysis or sexuology. Finkelhor declared the traditional moral laws of the white American middle class in rural areas would be the right and only suitable environment for educating healthy children for the nation. He didn't make a difference between children, adolescents, boys, girls. In his ideology, gays or transsexuals didn't exist. The pedophiliac would destroy all hopes and chances for children by having sex. In normal times, a fool as Finkelhor would have been forgotten without any effect. But in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan started his conservative campaign to clean up the American society by purifying sexual life, a man as Finkelhor became a key person. His research swept over the Atlantic Ocean and was introduced by conservative German scholars and the conservative politics Helmut Kohl. The academic sexuology just made AIDS research nothing else anymore because this was financed by the state and foundations. Pedophilia was running out of interest. The gay movement was just winning the AIDS battle. Everything out of this area wasn't relevant anymore. And the Green Party? The former revolutionists had become 40-year-old veterans with own families and new values. Pedophilia was a threat now, not only for their own offspring, but for financial taking part in democratic system. A man who was secretary didn't want to change the system. He wanted to have shareholders' value. You win electorates by promising everything will stay as it had been before or even in fantasy. You don't win with fundamental changes, just with cosmetic variants. Nobody wanted to hear results of sexual research anymore. There's no way to define pedosexuality because it doesn't exist as a special part outside the system. It is within the people, within sexual interest in families, clubs, high and subcultures. Nobody was interested anymore. In 1998, Conservative Party lost the election and a new government was appointed, Social Democrats and Green Party. Chancellor and all ministers were benefiters of sexual revolution from 1960s. Many of them had signed petitions for Peter Schult. The Secretary for Internal Affairs, Otto Schily, had been Schult's partner in helping imprison terrorists. The Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Joschka Fischer, had been a key person in an anarchistic group, one common friend of Peter Schult. There are photos and shaking hands and all these things. What changed? Nothing. Of course, gay marriage and anti-discrimination laws for white, well-off homosexuals in public service was introduced. And if anywhere in the world a dictator or religious pressure group suppresses homosexuals, the German government called the United Nations, except of course the dictator delivered gas for German households or bought many German weapons. The red-green government in Germany between 1998 and 2005 introduced all the supervision decrees and edicts who allow police and counselors to collect data from ordinary Germans just if they are suspected of being pedosexual. They do not have to act. Their sexual interest is enough for state research. Even the Nazis didn't persecute pedophiliacs of being pedophile. They persecuted the sexual contacts. If you know from a man who has sexual contacts, or consent or not, with non-adults, and you do not call the police, and the state gets information, you are persecuted as well. In history, we call it the Blockwardian system, a nice result of the social democratic and green reform movement, always favored by the homosexual emancipation groups and their pamphlets. The protagonist of gay marriage in Germany, Volker Beck, declared, German homosexuals had arrived in the heart of the society and they were willing to protect the society against enemies. Arabian terrorists, lazy social scum, or pedophiliacs. Every second week, German television offered a new report over sex tourism in Thailand. Pedophilia had been connected to rape, murder, and force. But if you went on streets in Germany in 1990s or 2000s, especially Eastern Germany, you could see real wildness. Drugs, violence, and sex as a flight from reality. But this, of course, had nothing to do with pedophilia. This was sexual revolution. The differences between children, adolescents, perverts, and babies were abundant. When Chancellor Gerhard Schröder was asked what should happen to pedophiliacs, he replied, "Wegsperren für immer," put them away for the rest of their life. Result of sexual liberalization. Huh? While the government's members left all their own roots in sexual politics, they started a new liberal reform in social policy. They introduced Hartz IV, Hartz IV, a complex of laws and edicts who makes it impossible for sub-proletarians or even workers to escape from poverty. Overnight, around 20% of German population had turned into internal losers, white trash. And of course, these people needed anyone to blame, an enemy they could attack. Not a politician, of course, but a pedophiliac, perhaps? Together with the introduction of Hartz IV, social democratic and green politicians started a new campaign saving the German youth and children against pedophiliac. Yellow Press assisted. And the gay movement, led by the failed student, failed journalist, failed parliamentary collaborator Volker Beck, assisted every time to prove that homosexuality was absolutely different from pedosexuality. In the gay porn movies and magazines, you could see nice feminine guys looking like boys having sex with older men. Metrosexuality and queer research flooded the cultural sciences in German universities, but all forms of sexual desire who were queer to reality were never identified by the scholars. Queer research in Germany meant interviewing well-off gay couples with 2 cars and 2 dogs. When Angela Merkel became chancellor in 2005, the climate didn't change, of course. So we had a homosexual secretary for foreign affairs who declared himself as gay. Nice. I remember Guido Westerwelle when he was running around with Kapuze shirts. Not anyone can't see who he is in 1990s. In politics, regarding sexual life, German government announced a new edict in 2008. So publication of pictures with minors in sexual poses will be punished. One of my friends thought he makes a joke. He sent members of parliament from all parties, conservative, social democratic, liberal, green, and socialists, a copy of a picture by Caravaggio, the Amor Boys. It is in the Vatican Museum. And he said, "Oh, I want to publish this picture. What, is it illegal?" What came on a reaction? The conservatives, of course, they were well educated, said, "Oh, it's Caravaggio, no problem." And but the socialist Linkspartei member of parliament, Halina Wawrzyniak, called the police to imprison my friend for endanger public security. Ms. Wawrzyniak also suggested to destroy the original picture. And the sexual researchers, did anyone in the widespread community oppose public discourse? No. Why not? Sexologists remember what had happened to sociologist Professor Rüdiger Lautmann in 1994 when he published a book about the living world of pedophiliacs in Germany, Die Lust am Kinde, the lust with children. Surprisingly, the pedophiliacs didn't live in lonely fortresses in Black Forest, but within the society, and they just differed in sexual interest, nothing else. No psychopathic personalities, no violators sitting behind trees, or exhibitionists waiting in school buses. Ordinary Germans, Lautmann risked to write that a problem in discourse might be that every erotic signal, what is sent to non-adults, is interpreted as abuse or rape. This would disturb terms and mix fiction and reality. This was, frankly said, nothing new. What happened? Lautmann's colleague at the University of Bremen, Günther Arment, small brother of the famous sexual advisor Gerhard Arment, started a campaign against Lautmann. He got assistance by Alice Schwarzer and so-called emancipation groups. Lautmann was accused of promoting rape and abuse. He never had written anything like that, but Schwarzer got the headlines, anarchist groups felt important, and Günther Arment, who had never published any peer-reviewed article or book before, was invited to congresses abroad. everyone was happy. Nobody published any objective sexuological essay anymore where hebephilia or pedophilia was separated. In German science, newspapers, TV reports, or public discourse at all, you see today pedophilia just takes place outside the families. What is a family today? Of course, a gay couple who adopts a child can be seen as a family now. So of course, there is no pedophilia. And in straight heterosexual families, it had never occurred before. Moreover, all pedophiliacs are male. It is interesting, gender studies have shown that sexual roles in a society can differ every time. But no scholar has ever thought about this might make it possible that a woman could desire sex with an adolescent. Of course not, because pedophilia is always combined with force, with rape. A woman cannot rape because she's weak, she's a woman. So the discourse over pedophilia helps to save patriarchalistic world into the 21st century, assisted by German gender scholars. All the pedophiliacs should live outside the society, especially in the outskirts of greater cities, the social slums. But why do these slums exist in a social economy? Nobody asks. And if adolescents go to pedophiliacs voluntarily, why do they do it? Do they have no families? This question is not part of the discourse. The child can never decide for itself, it is an object. The 17 years young child, as Helmut Graupner will explain later. But in the moment of its 16th or 18th birthday, it changes into a subject. A child can never have sex without rape. The childish innocence destroyed by sexology and psychoanalysis is saved again by green, socialist, social democrat, conservative, and liberal politicians. And of course, by the gay movement and all the colleagues who call themselves queer. Why didn't any one of them read, for example, Lee Edelman? The problem is he's publishing in English, and this is a great problem for German gender scholars. And what can we see? Sexual reforms just work in a society with secure economic present and future. Medicine, and especially psychiatry, is dependent from political wishes and not scientific drive. We were closer to sexual liberty 30 years ago, and now we are stepping back into the 1950s with the economic problems of the 1930s. A bad combination at all. What can US learn from Germany? Nothing, please. Politics with family values is just an excuse for moral and economic failure. If a politician recalls a family, he says public and politics have failed. He has failed. But a trip back to tribal laws is not good for sexuality of all people of every age. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florian. We'll have our next speaker as Robert Teixeira, who is completing his PhD dissertation in sociology at York University in Toronto. And I thought we would be remiss if we did not include at least one Canadian perspective in this conference, because certainly Canada is a nation very similar to us in many ways, that has nevertheless adopted its own set of rules and laws in the area of sexual regulation that at some points are more progressive, at other points perhaps not. But Rob will enlighten us about that.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I am from Canada, and my name is Rob Teixeira, or if you prefer, Teixeira, the Portuguese pronunciation. And I'm afraid I have more bad news to share with you about our topic. And it isn't from the mayor's seat in Toronto. It's it's of a different order, perhaps more serious. So the thing is, I'm completing my dissertation on the topic of how children and youth are regulated under child protection schemes. There's a very wonderful thread of discussion in our panel, and I'll try to touch on what other people have spoken of when appropriate. My work is in is embedded within certain theoretical literatures, and that has to do with queer theory and queer studies, but also literature based on social and moral regulation, which originated in the UK and has been transplanted into Canada. There's several important scholars in Canada in social and moral regulation. And particularly, I'm taking up my work, I'm developing an analysis of child protection programs in Canada, legislation and so on, based on the work governmentality and genealogy work, developed by Michel Foucault and others. So I'll just begin. Okay. We don't take consent into account anymore. Okay, now this is a quote. We don't take consent into account anymore. You may wonder who said that. Perhaps, someone who has ill intentions, or someone who may have, an ardent desire to inflict some kind of harm on others. But these words were uttered by our Justice Minister, Rob Nicholson, during the Justice Committee debates convened over Bill C-22, which was a precursor to a bill that eventually became law in Canada, Bill C-2, which was dubbed the Tackling Violent Crime Bill. And with this bill, the C-2 bill, it was an omnibus bill, so there were a number of legislative pieces rolled into it, having to do with mandatory minimum sentencing and also upping the sentencing for possession of guns and so on. And this was uttered and it became law in May of 2008. So Canada that has had an basic age of consent with important qualification since 1890, for the first time since 1890, the age of sexual consent, basic age of sexual consent rose to 16 from 14. Now, the age of consent for anal sex remains 18 in Canada. It's embedded in the criminal code, but there have been 4 provinces, that's like your states, 4 provinces, that have declared Section 150 of the criminal code unconstitutional in their, I was going to say state legislatures, in the provincial legislatures, courts. So with those opening words from our Justice Minister, Rob Nicholson, this is under the Conservative Harper government, which came into power in 2006. My paper will focus on the age of consent debates primarily. Now, I've also read up on changes to Canada's child pornography law since its inception in August of 1993, and there have been a few changes to the child porn law in Canada, to tightening up primarily, but especially in the wake of the Robin Sharp case, which you may know about in Canada, which went to the Supreme Court, which upheld the constitutionality of Canada's child porn law with 2 exemptions, very minor exemptions, written into the law, which I can get into later. But I'm primarily dealing with the age of consent debates due to the interest of time. And my empirical research is based on a recent round of legislative activity and the documents thereof. These are publicly available documents, of course, from the years 2001 to 2008 in Canada. So these years saw a series of public discussions, Justice Committee hearings, media reports, amidst a plethora of new legislative bills culminating in the passage of the Omnibus Crime Bill. This bill actually passed before there were a number of other efforts to change the age of consent law from about the late 90s, 98, 2000 is when the effort was taken up. And this law was the centerpiece of the Harper Conservative, get tough on crime agenda, and it was promoted as such in the throne speech and so on. So, as I mentioned, the law, this bill, which became law, increases the age of sexual consent in Canada, but didn't touch the anal sex provisions at all. That was left off the table. But it also created new criminal sanctions and increased mandatory minimum sentencing for gun possession. Now, this minimum sentencing for gun possession, which increased to, I think, 10 years, if I'm correct, was recently struck down by the Ontario court as unconstitutional last week. So that should be noted. In this paper, I'll offer an analysis of how governmental practices, legal regimes, and expert and popular discourses on child sexualities and child protection constitute a kind of political rationality of government that focus on and take as its object of examination youthful sexualities and its risky corollary, the sexually dangerous individual, which goes under various names. And these have become intensified governmental regulatory practices that have specific, socioeconomic, political effects. So my work draws on the literature, as I mentioned before, of social and moral regulation, especially its more contemporary elaborations based on the French social theorist Michel Foucault, his genealogical histories, and his work in studies in governmentality. I seek to uncover how a set of governing concepts and discursive strategies articulate specific ways of enabling law and youth and adult subjectivities as a field of governable objects. So I'm seeking to understand how these concepts have arisen, what are the limits, the constraints imposing claims to truth about the child and sexuality that go into the formation of assumptions around discourses around lawmaking and policy work. This constructs a field of governable objects that construct child and youth sexualities as it mandates specific interventions. Knowledge of populations and subpopulations, mediated primarily through expert discourses, constitute an aspect of governing identifiable populations through specific political rationalities, and what's also called in Foucauldian work, technologies of the self. This involves uncovering how knowledge-making practices variously prescribe or regulate culturally mandated subjectivities. And these subjectivities have come to the fore, I claim, in how contemporary government goes about making social policy around child protection. So, for instance, subjectivities such as what does it mean to be a parent? Who is a responsible parent under an increasingly intensified governmental regime that focuses on child protection? What is a child of youth, or youth, of course, central question. And who is the adult, the non-parental adult, queer or otherwise, or as someone who could possibly be deemed a dangerous sexual subject. So the pedophile, the sex offender, the child pornographer. These discussions are embedded in a culture of liberal democratic governance represented by professional bodies that range from, and now these are people that would be called to give depositions to justice committees and so on to produce, a sensible knowledge and claims to truth about the topic under discussion. So we have a range of people. We have parliamentarians, social workers, child welfare administrators, legal counsel, police officials, statisticians, sociologists, and autonomous citizens groups. And all of these people are together to produce and reproduce how we come to understand children and youth as an object of concern, as an object needing, a social object needing protection. Okay. So my research draws upon empirical material from this fairly deep well of publicly available documents, and I pursue a critical discourse analysis on them. It's a qualitative study of these parliamentary and justice committee discussions and related material, like depositions that were sent to Parliament, working memoranda from various groups that have presented in Ottawa, and so on. And just as a side note, I was involved during this research. I was involved with with an autonomous youth-led committee that were opposing the raising of the age of consent in Canada. We together drafted a deposition to give to the Justice Committee, and we went there as a group. And the person that presented was an 18-year-old activist by the name of Nicholas Dodds, and he's been a youth activist since about the age of 12, 13, in Toronto. Although politicians from across the mainstream political spectrum have mobilized around the issue of child protection in public discourse for the last 20, 30 years, in Canada and globally, the recent campaigns to raise the age of consent and tighten the provisions around child porn represents a significant shift, I will argue, in a movement of governmental power, signaling an intensification in regimes of regulation, in normalization, and disciplinary securitization that I think warrants sustained critical attention and vigilance. These are key questions that guide my reading of my empirical data. So I ask, how is it that gender, sexuality, and age relations are made a subject of calculable knowledge and governmental practice in this recent history, about a decade? What can the nature of these discussions of a knowable population of children and youth reveal about the nature of governing relations in the early 21st century in Canada? What can a close reading of the text of the committee discussions and other official public documents reveal about the various truth claims made and the calculative reasoning employed in the service of child protection and its various objects and categories of thought? And how are notions of youthful sexualities and the dangerous subject mobilized today within governmental discourses, and what effects are being produced by this mobilization? So in my research then, I've uncovered, these are probably 2,000 pages or more of material that I've gone through for my PhD research. And I'm just giving you a portion here. But I've identified three major streams of discussions or discourses that come out. They're identifiable patterns in the way people are discussing the need for increasing the age of consent and the production of a dangerous subject. So let me just run through them, and then I'll explain each of them I'll explain in more depth. So number one would be the socio-legal nature of parent-child relations and shifts in the public-private relations of authority are changing. Changing with regards to its internal structure, function, and in the relationship to the state and government, governmental regulation, a shift in power relations in the family, between parents and children, and so on. Number two, there's a marked intensity and securitization. I think that's a word that should become more common in discussing how the figure of the pedophile is mobilized today globally, of hegemonic identities around sexuality, age, gender, race, and class, especially along the normalizing registers of the prudential parent, the optimal child, and the sexually responsible citizen adult. Number three, so these are three major trends in the discourses that exist in my empirical material that I looked at. Number three is the mobilization of the dangerous sexual other, okay? The predator, the cyber predator, the pedophile, the child pornographer. They come up everywhere in these discussions, of course. And actually, what in terms of looking at the more scientific deliberations during the committee meetings, there's also a production of what I will call pedophile subjectivities, and also the subjectivities of what we might want to call a child pornographer, as a significant arm in what I'm calling sovereign power. I'm borrowing work from Foucault and Agamben, who's an Italian social philosopher, around national and global security movement and governmentalities. What I'm trying to do here is make some links between what some authors have addressed in a different context, and that is have described as threat governmentalities, i.e. racialized and racist notions of the Muslim or Arab immigrant, people who have been displaced by war and so on, refugees, the undocumented. And these bodies in the global stream are symptomatic of an abject figure, a figure that's made into a key threat that disrupts boundaries, borders, and are taken as a threat in many different dimensions, especially in our post-9/11 security state discourses. So my work looks at this set of interlocking discourses and how they frame child and youth sexualities and how they are envisioned as a site of vulnerability, and also how there is an emerging sexual site of danger that is driving ever-increasingly draconian child protection policies. Together they form a template of permissible discourses that are given authoritative scope within the committee proceedings, and they set parameters on what constitutes legitimate knowledge and an individual's ethical bearing, favoring specific subject positions and claims to truth in the arena of child protection. And these also play out in this idea of what a child should be, what our normative imaginaries should be about what children are, how they should conduct themselves, and how they should be sexual. And also, creating the monster, the man monster, which is often, codified as male. So I'll just, now I'm just going to add a bit more meat on the skeleton of these three discourse streams that have emerged from these debates that I've looked at.
And Rob, you have about 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay. Am I talking too slow? Okay. Maybe I can speed up.
You
Okay.
digressed some.
All right. So now in the first stream, I'm calling it "Give Power Back to the Parents," which is a quote from the deliberations. So parent-child relations are intensifying within the family as a unit of normalizing power and sovereign power. When these kind of discussions, giving power back to the parents, was endemic within these meetings. So the idea is that somehow the traditional or normalized family, even given its multicultural character in Canada, and now that gay and lesbian families are becoming more visible, somehow something has gone awry. And the traditional balance of authority and power needs to be reined in. And one way we're going to do that is by raising the age of consent and, in a way, deputizing parents as a kind of enforcing arm of the police and of the law in order to normalize their children's sexual choices. How this plays out through gender is often that a female that has been, a young female that's taken up with an older partner, heterosexual, and maybe has left home, is often deemed someone who doesn't know their own mind and is in need of corrective choice making, right? They're not the optimal young subject. When discussions of boys come along, because these committee discussions actually do talk about intergenerational relations with younger teenagers, with mostly people in their 20s. And it's usually framed as parents being frustrated with their children's choices, especially with girls. But with boys, we're seeing the play of the stranger danger, right? The older queer adult who is a pederast or pedophile who is predating on a young, innocent 16, 15, 14-year-old, whatever. Sometimes it might even be older, and these things come into play. So I'm saying here that these laws function paradoxically to center both the parent and the law as the absolute guarantor or protector of a young person's sexuality, while evoking the figure of the non-familial adult as a predator, an old story. But this as a result of dispossessing the young subject of desiring capacities. And when these desires do appear, and they are mentioned in the text, although young people are never heard from except that one person that our committee enabled to be there, these youthful desires are rendered irrelevant or perhaps dangerous to the social order. So we're beginning to see a kind of exclusionary movement, not only around the dangerous adult, but in terms of bracketing off and holding down complicated, messy, unruly, queer child, a non-normative practice that children often get into. My second finding was the securitization of identities, generational identities, around what's appropriate for certain ages. And of course, there was a lot of experts called in to discuss, using brain imaging studies and so on, the adolescent mind, the adolescent brain. And there was a lot of evidence that was taken as conclusive that it is the age of 16 where children develop the age of reason. So this was taken as fact. And it was rarely challenged in these committee debates. So now we have, science giving the acclaim around scientific fact, around a subpopulation of young people, reaching the age of reason at 16 and not before. And of course, the third is the greatest play that we've seen around the figure of the pet predator, which we've had a lot of discussion here lately. But I think one of the curious things I want to mention about the type of discussions that happened in the committee minutes is that there is some kind of visibility in these documents around intergenerational relations. They are discussed. So you have parents or other groups who talk about, we have to regularize, young people's choices around partners. So I don't want 15-year-old Sally to leave the house in a huff because she got into a fight with her dad and take up with her 25-year-old boyfriend. A lot of the stories are about parents, rescuing their children from what they feel are inappropriate choices. In one case, there's even an MP who breaks down someone's house to rescue a child for one of his constituents' parents. And he even admits he broke so many laws doing that. But to this day, he's never been charged with anything. So, for my conclusion, I just want to say that there's a curious imaginary going on in these debates, and they're situated within a certain specific time, last decade, and you have parliamentarians who are generally people who may have children around that age, let's say 12 to 18, and they often invoke their sense of closeness to that age group as giving them some kind of authority to speak the truth about what children are and what they should be. So these members of the committee and various witnesses invoke their own positioning as a parent or child to secure a speaking authority and personal urgency to the matter. So they have this imaginary where they're being, in my sense, they're wholly caught up in this Oedipal imagery of the parent-child relation that radically excludes the possibility that intergenerational sexualities may function as mutual and reciprocal relations, even as their existence is abundantly invoked. So there's kind of like this, I think Catherine mentioned this, the silence in the visibility, right? We're still making something visible, but we're darkening something else. So just to conclude, because I've gone over time, I just wanted to draw out some of the implications for the way lawmaking is approached today in Canada and in other places around this intensification of the figure of the pedophile subject, which is mentioned everywhere in these committee meetings, and is made the ground upon which we're going forward in terms of child protection strategies. And I think that has to do with the intensification of what I want to call a biopolitical movement, not only in terms of how families are constructed, in terms of how they're being tied closer to the law, but in the construction of pedophile subjectivities as a threat. So here we have emerging in the 21st century, I would say, there's like twin figures of the terrorist and the pedophile that secure a kind of biopolitical governmentality which seeks to radically exclude and certain practices and certain individuals from citizenship and creates them as a radical threat, an unknown threat. And it is a way, of course, of moving forward in harsher and harsher penalties, regulation, legal measures, and in creating communities that are more vigilant when they're approaching this kind of danger talk, right? The individual that is unruly, not able to be redeemed in any sense. It needs to be eliminated in a radical sense. I think this is a dangerous development. Of course, we've seen it with the figure of the terrorist, but I think it is important to start looking at how dangerous sexual subjects are transforming the field of play for all of us, no matter who or what we desire, who we are. And it also definitely continues to keep other questions around children's participation in the culture as sexual citizens and as democratic citizens at bay. And it shuts them down. That's
Okay.
the end of my talk. Thank you very
Rob.
much.
Good. I know there must be people with strong feelings and opinions on this subject who will want to ask a question. Unfortunately, we're running 15 minutes late, but I think we can probably accept at least one question from the audience. Yes.
So I know that there's a lot of resistance around these topics, and I sort of work with these topics too. Maybe more on a personal level, how do you deal with that resistance, and how do you sort of keep going, and how do you respond to it?
Anyone?
You first.
Well, I work in Utah, so that's always an interesting context. I insist, in teaching a course on queer theory to have a section that really sort of rattles all their cages, and I try to create a kind of equal opportunity, unsafe environment in my class. And so instead of like a kind of universal safety, which we're going to cleanse the discourse of all commentary about racism or sexism or whatever, I just tell students to come back at me, speak your mind. And I've had students say that in queer theory, they're really, even straight students, even, church-going Mormon students who take queer theory, I was with you until we got to that section, on pedophilia. And then I just felt myself violently resisting you. And I say, good, the whole point is to talk. And this sort of notion that we can't even have the conversation, which kind of goes back to this idea that you can't talk to children about sexuality because then you're literally implanting sexuality inside children by even talking to them, has made it impossible to do all kinds of social science studies that you can never get past an IRB board. That's why fiction is so important, because you can't do the social science studies in which you can actually get children or kids to talk in this vibrant manner. So fortunately, in my case, I don't have to worry so much about trying to figure in or weigh in on the law, but just to sort of show that if one goes to the land of representation, how unbelievably diverse and bold and vibrant it is. So just to give a quick example and to stop, Henry James, is fascinating because in this novella, The Pupil from 1891, which is right when the word homosexuality is sort of coming into play, you have a story that's about man-boy love that's a tender response to parental abuse. And Henry James is about as big as it gets, in the literary world. So I'm just trying to show my students this sort of diverse scene and raise the questions. And that's, I think, where Rob left us off, is that it's creating a kind of interesting ripple effect across all sexualities, and that's what we need to grapple with and understand. Just to have the conversation. We can have wildly different ideas. I think that's really important. But to really make the conversation available is sort of the first step.
I work in contract land, so in some of my sessionals, I have a course called Families, Childhood, and Social Change, and I've started to introduce this material, and I did at Brock University 2 years ago as well, and I was actually surprised how well the conversation went. Now, there are people who are uncomfortable. I preface the weeks that we take up child sexuality. I have them reading Freud, but I have them reading material, I forget the author, but there's a recent book on contemporary panics over child sexuality that includes a lot of discussion around child pornography laws and predators and so on. I think that it's in how you approach the material. It's being sensitive to how you frame it, how you're going to link it into other aspects of the work we're doing on the syllabus. And I guess I've been pleasantly surprised. I don't know, maybe Canada's different, perhaps, but we've been told it is, but anyway, because I was frankly terrified. I'm a sessional. I don't even have my PhD yet, right? So I don't have a lot of protection at the university, and I'm kind of, beginning my career front end with this material. So there is a lot of anxiety, but I think The important thing is, as Catherine mentioned, is we're having a conversation. And I find in some of my work, community-based work with LGBT activists, when I've tried to raise this issue, it's about getting specific, really, because you're battling, ideological ghosts, right? That keep getting brought up in people's minds, right? It's there. It's always there. It's pervasive. So I think the key with having really good discussions is first remain calm, and then and getting specific. Okay, this is not what I said. This is what I'm saying. Let's get to the specifics about a case or situation. What's happening here? I think these conversations are very important to have. They have to be had carefully. And I've worked in committees with women who have been survivors as well, talking about childhood sexual practices that included intergenerational sex as a positive or benign thing. And it's all in the approach. And, we become really good friends, but it's in the approach, I think, in how it's taken up. Very careful, I guess, little baby steps. But we're at the beginning of, I guess, an emerging, more complex discussion, perhaps.
You're lucky guys.
Florian, you have something to add there?
Just short, in Germany it's a bit different. You can have no problems while teaching in the university with students, but you get real problems with if you ask veterans of the debates of the 1970s, especially if they became important politicians. And especially medicine and psychiatry, they are not interested in this discourse. And they're telling me, you will never get funds or anything like else.
Well, of course not.
Of course, I don't want it.
Well, with that, we're going to have to bring the session to an end, but we will get a chance to talk more about the whole issue of youth sexuality in the next session after lunch, where we'll be dealing with pornography and how it affects children. So I hope to resume the discussion there, as well as during lunch. Now, for those of you who are on the program or helping with the program or are volunteers, we want to have a meeting over in the jury room and do some deliberation. But for the rest of you, we'll give you an hour, and we'll resume here at 2:30. I mean, are there places close by that anyone can recommend for lunch?
If you can speak German, it's quite easy because it's everything published.
Unfortunately, our law school
But if you don't
people
speak
have
German,
abandoned
it's a great
us.
problem. Sorry,
Would it be a translator to English?
Oh, there you are,
nobody's
Karen.
interested in it.
That it's open on Saturday.
No, it was.
Is there any place across the street? Over on Guadalupe. There are all kinds of places over on Guadalupe Street.